All right. First, I just want to say fantastic, my colleagues, and thank you for this opportunity. And blessings to this genius on the panel, Inole Air, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Utsi. Good to see you again, friend. And my good friend, Dr. Groy. So good to see and feel and hear you, Dr. Haggins. I'm just not going to say and try not to say what they have said. So keep clicking. I just a few assumptions and points that I want to make out and bring out and focus also on the notion of how do we heal, grow, and thrive. So if you can keep clicking, I'm going to, a few assumptions around the world is socializing us how to dodge race. That's a reality that we have to deal with, which is, I'm interested in what Dr. Uzi mentioned around racial socialization, but we got to be interested in racial encounters as much as symbols, that what happens in 2 minutes can be quite powerful, as Dr. Groy described, and so you saw in those videos. 2 minutes is a long period of time to be assaulted and to be dehumanized. And so as much as people talk about systemic change, that's important. It won't happen without relationship change. We need both. Legal remedies are important, but they won't heal emotional trauma. We need to get close and proximal. Character is not as important, but competence is. How do we notice, how well do we negotiate these racial encounters and these problems? And that should be a basic understanding of competence in every profession working with our children. But I do believe we can change racial outcomes in proximal spaces. Next slide, please. When we think about racial encounters, we think about how what Shelley Harrell's definition of what is a stressful racial encounter is when we are overwhelmed, not only with our emotions, but our body and our cognitions are all out of whack. And so when we think about healing, we think about stress, we got to think about that stress influences our thoughts, our feelings, and our bodies. And if we're not tracking that, we're not able to capture the full impact, not only of the trauma, but how to heal outside of that trauma. So when we think about our work around racial literacy, which I'll describe in a second, we're thinking about what happens in a moment, in a face-to-face encounter. And a lot of the 2-minute encounters that happen in race in this society end up in disaster, if you think about it. And so many of us are focused on ideology, focused on legal approaches to race, but the trauma has to be addressed in these very small moments as much as the systemic moments. Next slide. We know that racial stress is important, but I'm going to focus you on threat, not just stress. When we think about stress, it is a sort of a different frame than threat, which is at a high level of fear. And so I would argue that over across these 3 centuries, we have been dealing with rage and threat, what Carol Anderson talks about, what Claude Steele talk about a racing mind, that when we are overwhelmed and stressed, our brains work overtime. We see some things in front of us and don't see other things. And we think about the work of William Smith around racial battle fatigue and Dr. Uchi's work around brilliant work on measurement of the perseveration and hypervigilance that we go through, adults and children who are Black, from trauma that interfere with our learning, as Dr. Groy described. And then the notion of dangerousness, being criminal, perceived as criminal and guilty, is very important biologically. Next slide. We can keep going. So part of the notion of threat changes how we think about healing, growing, and thriving. So if we can think about in those videos you saw that those were rageful, threatening reactions, that those were at higher levels of an incapacity, almost hateful, that we have to understand that how we deal with threat versus stress is very important. In some of the work, when we look at the neuroscience, some people respond to the faces of Black men and boys much like spiders and snakes. It's a primitive reaction. And unless we have strategies to understand that those primitive reactions can occur in less than 2 minutes, we're missing out. Next slide. And part of it is we know that some of Philip Goff's work is brilliant around if we compare Black boys at 10 versus white boys, they're perceived as less childlike, not innocent, and 4.5 years older. Imagine what we give up when we adultify our boys. Next slide. And the same thing out of Georgetown. Oh, this is true for not only 10-year-old boys, but 5-year-old boys. When it comes to perceiving 5-year-old boys' faces as triggering thoughts of guns and violence. Next slide. But it's also true for girls. If you look at the Girlhood Interrupted, the research out of Georgetown Law School, about even as black and brown girls are thought of as adults, it allows folks to withhold affection and support out of the belief that they are not, in my opinion, and in Dr. Galt's opinion, they're not human. What he talks about is dehumanization. If I see you as not as you are, I'm dehumanizing you. If I add you and consider you older, I'm dehumanizing you. And in a big way, next slide, those elements can trigger threat. Dr. Groy has already talked about preschool expulsion. My good friend Walter Gilliam has done that brilliant work. And I usually ask people around the country, which grade do you think? And the only thing I'll add, next slide, most people, when I ask them, which grade do you think students of all racial groups are expelled, they pick middle school, 7th or 8th grade. And I think that's because we're all traumatized by our junior high school years. Next slide. And the reality is it's pre-K. And just to add to what Dr. Groy was describing, that pre-K students are expelled at 3 times the rate of kindergarten through 12th graders. Next slide. And those are racial disproportionate issues in which Gilliam describes the overreactions, egregious overreactions, which I would argue is threat-based behavior for 4- and 5-year-olds. Next slide. So racial stress harms our perceptions. It harms how we see black and brown people, but it also harms our health in these ways that we could talk about, but you've already talked about it. Next slide. Next slide. So the thought about our healers. So what are we going to do about it? And some of our work around racial socialization has been found to have some very significant going up. Next slide. And I'm going to ask you to go back in a sec. Most of the way we look at racial socialization, and it was mentioned by Dr. Utsi around the silence from the Tulsa folks, that in many respects, the question that we have to ask is, how do we talk to our loved ones? What are the components of healthy racial socialization, or protective or affirmative? And these are some of the elements, that we need to consider when we're talking to our children and when they're talking to us. Go back a slide. So we've learned that racial socialization can be protective, but the question is, why is it protective? And the theory that I've created suggests the reason it can be protective, talking, not silence, is because it prepares young people and adults for racial hostility by reducing the stress that often comes, the unpredictable fear or threat. If I've had some schooling and I've had some love while I'm getting that schooling about racism and the history of its horror, when I see it in front of me, I've seen this before. This is not the first time my mother, my father, my brother has told me about this. And if my stress goes down, my confidence goes up, which means I can engage instead of fight, flight, or fright these moments. Next slide. So if we look at, next slide, if we look at some of the research on this, we have benefits of racial socialization linked up the wazoo, talking to even preschoolers. There's impact around self-esteem, anger management in our work with adolescents and academic achievement. But even this, we found that parents who actually feel confident about talking to their kids about race, it also reduces their racial worries, their worries about their children being racially profiled. Can you imagine what we could do in a village if everybody was supporting each other around this effort? And what does that mean for reparations, we might ask ourselves. Next slide. So part of the notion is we know that teachers of color and white teachers in schools have significantly different reactions to racial politics in the classroom. They're less threatened by those racial encounters. And it seems it's not just race that differentiates whether a teacher is competent in the classroom. It's also, have they been racially socialized? Even white teachers who've been racially socialized are less frightened by racial conversation. Black students bringing up issues in the classroom. Very important dynamic. Next slide. So we'll go to the next slide. So in another study that Dr. Jason Collins and I have been working on, looking at students in independent, predominantly independent schools, we know that students of color who perceive their schools as threatening, that the more threatening they see the school, the more stress they experience, except when they report having some coping strategies to navigate that. The more coping strategies they have, even in a hostile environment, they are less bothered by that hostility, and in some respects, have other strategies to cope academically quite well. And I want to talk about that, not about coping, but healing, growing, and thriving. Next slide. Now, this is not just true for middle schoolers. The older you get, it seems like the more coping strategies you have, the less the more you are buffered from that threatening context. And we know how schools can be. Next slide. So the conclusions is, if we're thinking about racial stress and threat, we've got to think about proximal relationships and those 2 minutes that we're describing. Next slide. So we've been talking more about how do we turn racial socialization into an intervention? How do we enhance the protective, the affirmative, and the corrective parts of it? And so 3 skill sets we teach now, even to 3rd graders on up to CEOs, is the ability to read, recast, and resolve racially stressful encounters. Next slide. Reading is this ability to see the racial elephants in the room, in the moment, in my teacher, in my friends. And do I want to say, if I see it, maybe I can do something about it. It's around interpreting accurately what's happening in those moments. Next slide. Reading is fundamental to racial literacy. Recasting or reframing is this ability to use mindfulness with a focus on healing, growing, and thriving in the moment. Next slide. We call it CLCBE, calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale. It's a mindfulness approach to help reframe racial threats in ways that I can engage them instead of swallow them and swallow the Kool-Aid of that hate, or take everybody out in a particular way, or in simply sense, freeze. Calculate is around what am I feeling in the moment and how intense is it on a scale of 1 to 10. Locate is where in my body do I feel it, trying to make sure we get all of where that stress is affecting us. And communicate is around what am I saying to myself and what memories, what images come to the mind in those moments. You can see and say a lot to yourself. And breathing, exhaling brings oxygen to your brain so you can think and hear clearer. Your peripheral vision and hearing become much more accessible, and you're a better decision maker in the process. Next slide. And resolving is how do I make a healthy decision in the moment that isn't an underreaction where I pretend that trauma didn't bother me, that moment that what somebody said didn't bother me when it did, or overreaction, and that's when I curse out everybody, the cat and the dog and the hamster. It had nothing to do with it. Next slide. I was in next slide, we'll pass that. We're doing racial literacy studies now with high schoolers. We're finding a lot out about what they can take in quite quickly. It so happens, this is why I love Dr. DeGroy's work around confrontation. If you look at the research on confronting prejudice, it's very healthy in the longer run, not only for the victim, but also the perpetrator. That if you stand up, there's something healthy about healing, growing, and thriving, about calling out the harm that has been done to you, even if it's calling it to yourself. And I was in a 5th grade classroom in Chicago, and I was speaking to 5th graders at 7:30 in the morning about calculate, locate, and communicate. And before I could get to the last one, communicate, a Native American girl stood up and said, I'm angry at a 9 that I'm the only Native American girl in this school, and I can feel it located in my stomach like it's a bunch of butterflies fighting with each other, so much so that it's like they fly up into my throat and choke me. The brilliance of her and her family to teach her about noticing what's happening to her when she is stressed or threatened is a skill that I think all of us can learn from. Next slide. I'm going to end. So this is some of the work that the racial literacy work that we've applied to communities, and not only with teachers, but teaching barbers to be health educators for Black men between the ages of 18 to 25. We have had for 20 years now a basketball project where we help kids manage stress in the moment of hostilities on the court. We're bringing families in to teach them how to talk to their children about race, and then having the children challenge their parents about notions as well, to tell their stories and not be silent, as Dr. Ussi was describing. And other places. Next slide. We've also been influential in the work of Sesame Street, which some of you know has opened up a racial justice community focus for little kids, and that's very important. And they use some of our ideas called Breathe, Feel, and Share in that process. Next slide. And I think that might be the last one. And take-home points is we've got to pay attention to racial stress and how it affects our bodies, feelings, and thoughts, but don't forget racial threat. Racial threat is another animal. It represents and reflects the rage of white supremacy over these centuries, and it will impair our perceptions, decisions, behaviors, and relationships. Feeling threatened is human. Fight, fight, or flight. Avoiding, though, the threat, not facing it, will leave us unethical and incompetent. Racial stress is something we can see and we can do something with. Those who seek help are courageous. And this is not about blame, but it is about accountability and preparation. Next slide. There's a point in the letter from a Birmingham jail where Martin Luther King is not a preacher, he's not a prophet. All of a sudden, he turns his writing to being a parent. He says, you know, you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television. Martin Luther King is in the moment of his writing having a stress response about how he's going to protect his own 6-year-old daughter from the onslaught of hate and white supremacy. And he goes on to say, to see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky. And I can think of no more noble thing that we are here for, and for reparations, is to make sure that our children do not form or do not see those ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in their little mental skies. And I will end on that point. Thank you.